Good evening, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to Argyle Primary School. Welcome to What Makes Great Assessment. It's an event organised in collaboration with the Chartered College and Evidence-Based Education. And we've organised the event to facilitate, to stimulate professional dialogue around the effective and positive use of assessment. And we're going to get started in just a moment, but there's a couple of announcements to make first. So, first of all, a huge thank you to the head teacher, Jemima Wade, and the staff of Argyle Primary School for having us here tonight at the end of what has probably been a very busy day. So could we please show our appreciation to the school? And Jemima has informed us that there will not be a fire alarm tonight. So if you do hear one, go through those doors, down the stairs, and into the playground. Now, I need to notify you that we are videoing the event tonight, and the video will go out on the Chartered College YouTube channel. We're also attempting, fingers crossed, to use the latest technology to live stream the event. So to the panel, please keep it clean. No swearing. What makes great assessment is family entertainment and going out before the watershed. If you are tweeting, please consider using the hashtag #AssessBetter, being careful to use the correct number of S's, otherwise it's a very different conversation indeed. One about donkeys or bottoms or something like that. And finally, we do have wine and juice left over, I think, and once we're finished, you're very welcome to stay, continue the discussion, have a chat with people in the room. So, now we're ready to go. I'm going to hand over to my colleague, Stuart Kime, Director of Education at Evidence-Based Education, and our chair for the evening.
So, our host for this evening's event, Argyle Primary School, is an ambitious, fully inclusive community school in the heart of London, which in 2012 received the Camden Award for Inclusion. With children from 23 ethnic backgrounds speaking more than 25 languages, this is a school described by its head teacher, Jemima Wade, as one strong community united by a clear set of values and a very clear ambition. And on behalf of the Chartered College Teaching, Evidence-Based Education, and everyone here this evening, I want to add my thanks to James there for hosting us this evening. Assessment is a vital component of education. But it's one about which we all need to be better informed, have a more complete understanding in order to use it appropriately, efficiently and effectively. And tonight's event is designed really to help to develop this understanding by engaging our panel around three key questions. And our panel tonight is an illustrious one, and I shall introduce them very briefly in alphabetical order. But that means that I have to introduce somebody who hasn't actually arrived yet. So, Daisy Christodoulou, who will be here, is Head of Assessment at ARC Schools and author of the books 7 Myths About Education and Making Good Progress, The Future of Assessment for Learning. In July of this year, she'll become Director of Education at the Assessment Innovators No More Marking. She's the monkman of her generation because Daisy also holds the honour of captaining the winning team in 2007's University Challenge contest. Professor Rob Coe, at the end of the table there, is Director of the Centre for Evaluation and Monitoring at Durham University and a former maths teacher. He's co-author of the EEF's Teaching and Learning Toolkit and their DIY Evaluation Guide, and is a member of Ofquad's Standards Advisory Group. As well as being an international assessment expert, Rob's work earned him membership of the Blob in 2013, and those glasses really are in many ways reminiscent of a former Secretary of State for Education, Rob. Sara Lee, to my left here, is head teacher of Tarporley High School and Sixth Form College in Cheshire, an 11 to 18 school with 1,100 students and home to the Cheshire Vale Teaching School Alliance, a TSA which truly embraces an evidence-informed approach to its work. A national leader of education and native of Cheshire, Sara is passionate about collaboration amongst teachers, something which is highly evident if, like me, you have the pleasure of visiting her school. Tim Oates is a man with a busy summer ahead of him, reviewing, as one does, Sweden's textbooks. As Cambridge Assessment's Group Director of Assessment Research and Development, Tim has advised the UK government on assessment policy and has described education as being about the connection of deep knowledge and a rewarding life, suggesting that it's only those with blinkers on who set those two things in opposition. The force of nature that is Professor Dame Alison Peacock is the Chief Executive of the Chartered College of Teaching. Author of Assessment for Learning Without Limits and former head teacher of 14 years at Wroxham School in Potters Bar, Alison's Learning Without Limits mantra speaks volumes to her approach in education, as does her self-professed personal dictum, "Don't mess this up, Peacock." David Weston leads the Teacher Development Trust, an independent charity which aims to transform professional learning in schools. A former physics teacher, David led a grassroots campaign which championed the creation of what has become today's Chartered College of Teaching. As well as being chair of the Teachers Professional Development Expert Group at the DFE, David can lay claim to being ranked 13th in the UK for Latin American dancing, and is also a proficient coder in Ruby on Rails. Let it not be said that this man is not a polymath. Please put your hands together and welcome your panel. So to the format of the evening. I'll ask each member of the panel the same 3 questions. Firstly, I will ask each member to tell us what they believe makes great assessment. Following on from that, each person will be asked to tell us what they perceive are the current and foreseeable challenges and uncertainties facing educators. And finally, we'll hear suggestions for action that the profession itself can take to address these challenges. A recording of this event will be available on both the website of the Chartered College of Teaching and Evidence-Based Education, and as Jamie said before, we're live tweeting using the hashtag #AssessBetter. So to our first question, and we're going to go through in alphabetical order for no other reason than that seems simplest, but obviously that means that we're going to have to reshuffle Daisy at some point. So we're going to start with Rob Coe, and then move on to Sarah and Tim, Alison and David. So the first question, and if you could use the microphone that is there and then pass it along, is very simply, what makes great assessment?
Assessment needs to contain information. So one surprising thing about that is that an assessment that can't surprise you is not an assessment. In other words, if it doesn't have the power to tell you something you didn't know already, then it isn't an assessment. If it's just eliciting information that you've already got, or condensing or summarizing something that is a judgment you've already made, in my book that doesn't count as an assessment. And that means that a lot of the things that pass for assessment, where people talk about data's become a dirty word in our system, because it usually means that kind of thing where you just write down a number out of your head and put it in an Excel spreadsheet. So that is not assessment, people. Assessment needs information, and one of the ways to think about this from a technical point of view is how much information is in there. So one piece of information, one level. And I know levels are gone, but we still have levels, don't we? We used to have the 4Bs and the 7As, and now we have working towards, working at greater depth and all that stuff. They're still levels. We haven't got rid of levels. So none of that is assessment, because there's one piece of information in that judgment, unless the judgment is underpinned by a whole series of independent bits of information. If you take a 20-item test, then there are 20 pieces of information, or you hope there are if they're good items, 20 pieces of information in there. If you just take a number out of your head, that's one. So it isn't, in a sense, it's not an assessment, it's just not a very good one. Volume's gone up. So, for example, another way assessment can fail to contain information is by being pre-constrained. If you're being asked to fill in tracking information about the progress that pupils are making this term or this half term or whatever it is, and you know what level they were at before, and you know what is required, otherwise people are going to be on your back, that's not assessment either, because the numbers that you can put in, or the judgments or the categories, are pre-constrained by those requirements. And similar we see, for example, when you look at the profiles of things like the early years foundation stage, with a massive spike at 34, because 34 means you're expected level on all 17 early learning goals, or the phonics screening test where we see that huge discontinuity in response because people knew what the pass mark was, and for some reason that was the mark that all children seem to get, or just slightly above. So none of that's assessment because there isn't information in it. And to answer the question, great assessment doesn't do that. It's a bit of a negative answer, but there it is.
Thank you, Rob. Thanks, Sara. You just pass it along. Okay, so you'll see that thankfully we have been joined by Daisy Christodoulou, and allowing her to take, well, just one breath, we will now move to Daisy and ask her the same question. So Daisy, what makes great assessment?
Thanks. Sorry I'm late, everyone. So what makes great assessment? I think one thing that's really important is purpose, clarity of purpose. So knowing what you want from an assessment, knowing what you're expecting to get from it, because some assessments can be fantastic for one purpose and terrible for others. And I think it's really important to be clear about what it is you want, because I also think that assessments, you can't overload them with too many purposes. I think that's what we've seen happen a lot with a lot of national assessments. I just caught the end of what Rob was saying, that you can have an amazing assessment, but if you try to use it for national accountability, it can often pull a very good assessment out of shape. And I think one thing that's happened with GCSEs over the past few decades is that GCSEs were really originally meant to be, that the purpose was to assess how pupils were doing. And then almost unnoticed, they became a mechanism for assessing how schools were doing. And it might seem very simple to move from assessing how pupils are doing to assessing how schools are doing, but actually that's a fundamentally different thing. And I think GCSEs as a measure of pupil attainment have been compromised somewhat by this other use that's been forced on them to be used to assess how schools are doing. So I think that's a good example of how putting too many purposes onto one test can compromise it. So I think purpose is really important. And I also think it's really important to think about the validity of the inferences you are making from tests. So to see whether you are justified in making the assumptions you make from it. So for example, I mean, and again, an obvious example, when you look at a maths paper that's very wordy and has lots of word problems, on the one hand, you might be able to make great inferences about how pupils are going to do in real-world math problems. On the other hand, is that going to be a very good assessment of an EAL pupil's math skills? So again, thinking all the time about what inferences you're making and whether you're justified in making them. And I think also then the reliability of an assessment. So I think reliability is a precondition of validity. So you can come up with all kinds of very authentic assessments that look like they're very valid because they're asking pupils to do real-world tasks. But those kinds of assessments can often be very hard to mark reliably. And that really matters because if two people, a group of markers, completely disagree on the marks they'd award to something, that's a huge problem. How can you then say that the inferences you're making are valid? So I think we need to think really carefully about the purpose of the assessments we're doing. We're using them to assess pupils, to assess teachers, to formatively assess, to summatively assess for university entrance. What's the purpose? To think very carefully about the inferences we're making and if we're justified in making them, and to think also about the reliability. So can we be sure that people agree on what a good answer is or what good is on a particular assessment?
Thanks, Daisy. So, Sara Lee, what makes great assessment?
Okay, thanks. I think I'm probably going to say a few simple and obvious things from the school point of view, really. But I've enjoyed reading Daisy's book. It echoes lots of debates we've been having in school for a long time, really, about purpose and about what we're really doing when we're assessing, which is why I've gone for responsive teaching, the Dylan William term, because I'm saying really, I think in schools it has to start with what serves teaching. So I'm saying, I would say great assessment is great responsive teaching. It's inextricable from teaching. If it's not fit for purpose, it's going to actually limit the quality of the teaching. Poor assessment practice will limit quality of teaching. Great teaching will be integrated with great assessment. It is primarily a process whereby a teacher and a student, and I think they're the key people involved, or a pupil, find out what the student knows and can do and how they can take the next steps. So that's for me primary. I think it is massively linked to curriculum and a great curriculum, and so those three things just have to be very closely tied in together. So as school leaders, we're keen on our assessment policies and systems, but are consistent. But I think we've also got to allow for different ways of doing assessment in different subjects and different age levels and so on. So I think it can look diverse, but it must be focused on what teachers want to know, be timely, be well communicated, the scope for continuously getting better at the way we do it. But we need a shared understanding of great assessment, which is why I welcome Daisy's book, this debate. I think it's something we've been grappling with for a long time in schools. I think it's affected by the culture in schools, the relationships among staff, where a school finds itself, quality of CPD, the extent to which teachers feel able to take risks. These are crucial to making great assessment within the school context. It's got to be fit for purpose, so we have to have that debate about why we're doing it. I think that, the thing that has bothered me for a long, long time is, can it serve formative and summative purposes, which we constantly try and make it do in school for reasons I think we all understand. I was told in 2005 by a leading Ofsted inspector, I'd just become a head and my school didn't have a tracking system, and so that went straight into the report that I had to have a tracking system, and I sort of was trying to grapple with that. But there's immense pressure on using these interim summative assessments within school to track, to do appraisal and so on, and I think that we've got to go back to the primary purpose, that it has to support teaching and learning, and I think there are huge real tensions and compromises there that are happening all the time. But I think for school leaders, for myself, people like me, we've got to try to protect space to develop really great assessment within schools and try to resist some of the pressures that distort it.
Thank you. So great assessment contains information. It's surprising. It's purposeful and acts in service. It's not the master. It enables us to draw valid inferences. It's integral and integrated. So, Tim, from your point of view, what makes great assessment?
Thanks very much indeed. Now, I was really worried about talking tonight about good assessment because essentially I'm going to say it's pretty boring. So why is good assessment boring? Well, if you go into a room and switch on the light switch and the light comes on, we don't get that excited. Now, if the Victorians got pretty excited about electric light because it wasn't around much at the time, and maybe if there's not much good assessment around, we can get excited about it. I suppose it would be exciting if you flick the switch and the bulb blows, or the room catches fire, or it doesn't go on and you stumble around in the dark. And it's actually getting quite a powerful metaphor for bad assessment. Bad assessment tends to be exciting. It does excite people because it's around some things that we really care about. Bad assessment results in narrowing the curriculum. If the outcomes are used badly and for the wrong purposes, we get pretty excited. If it's a poor predictor of performance in a first year of a degree program or in medical education, we get pretty excited about it. But in a way, good assessment should be boring. It should be a service function that operates effectively. Of course, most people, if they're talking about assessment these days, say, oh yeah, it's really exciting because of all the technology. And Rob and I are involved in some exciting stuff about crowdsourced assessment, actually asking teachers what questions they ask of children and whether we can harness those in more formal assessment. As assessment specialists, we're pretty excited about assessment, but we're excited about it because of the underlying measurement principles. I think we should be more excited about assessment because of what we are trying to assess and getting at it. And that becomes of importance as well as being exciting. What we call in the assessment community the construct, a person's understanding of the idea of empire, or whether they understand the behaviour of electrons, what they can know, understand and can do. It's the construct, it's what we're trying to measure. It's not terribly exciting as a science. Great assessment is accurate. That's the angle that I'm going to take tonight. It measures things with fidelity, and by doing this, it provides valuable information to pick up what Rob is emphasising. Most importantly, it can be depended upon. And this is where I'm going to get controversial. Maybe only an assessment geek would understand the controversy. But the controversial bit is this. I'm interested in high-stakes assessment, summative assessment, and what people call low-stakes assessment, low-stakes formative assessment designed to directly support learning. And I see those as needing to be equally accurate. It is as important to get an inaccurate GCSE grade as it is to tell a child they're bad at something when they're actually quite good at it, or the reverse. So I don't accept this high-stakes, low-stakes distinction. Because if you're a 7-year-old, what's said to you on a particular occasion can be incredibly important in terms of your learning identity. So the question in the classroom, which probes a child's understanding and where the answer helps the teacher's insights into the way in which a child's understanding is building up, can be as important to the educational life as a child as the grade he or she obtains in a high-stakes examination. But I think accuracy is at the heart of good assessment. Some analysis explains accuracy in terms of validity, which Daisy mentioned, at its simplest, whether an assessment measures what it's intending to measure. If this is a fundamental quality, alongside it, an assessment must be fit for purpose, again something that's been emphasised, immune to maladministration, manageable, affordable, with timely and useful results. Of course, these qualities are easy to state in principle and difficult to deliver in practice. That's our lives in assessment agencies. That they're features that can be in tension. High accuracy can mean high cost. Boy, I can make GCSE very reliable. Dependable assessment can mean high levels of bureaucracy. These real-world tensions mean that fine-tuning, using the idea of fitness for purpose, is at the heart of practice in designing and administering and evaluating great assessment.
Thank you very much, Tim. I like the notion of great assessment being boring, and I'm sure Twitter will as well. Okay, so let's move on. So to Alison Peacock, so the same question. What makes great assessment?
Thank you. So I'm really going to focus on early years and primary education and think about what makes great assessment in that phase. And I'm absolutely convinced that is about really informing the quality of teaching. Because if we don't know what's been learnt today, how do we know what to teach tomorrow? And it's about children from the very earliest days being involved in assessing their understanding, sharing their understanding, engaging in dialogue that reveals misconceptions, enabling them to achieve success against criteria that they actually determine according to the feedback they receive. I'm not talking about acres of written feedback from the teacher. I'm talking about the feedback from the learning process that enables children to be able to really have a confidence about what they're doing, where they can have a sense that whatever they try next is the next step along the journey. So for me, great assessment is not an end in itself. Great assessment is part of a process that enables really brilliant learning to take place. And it should be encouraging and enabling. It shouldn't be a judgment that we fear. This week, as any of us in primary education are aware, is, of course, SATS week. And this week, probably for the first time since I'd stopped being a head teacher, I was really quite glad not to be going into school this week, because it's a terrifying week, even when we know that the children are coming in and absolutely going for their personal best, which is always the case in the school where I was working. We used to talk to the children about, go for your personal best. It's not about what anybody else achieves. But even then, that kind of palpable sense of anticipation and concern that's there. Travelling into London, as I was this morning, there were 2 people travelling along, both of them talking about their children and the assessments they would be taking part in school today, and being fearful for them about what might happen. So for me, great assessment is definitely, as Dylan William would say, the servant, not the master. It's definitely a part of excellent pedagogy. It should be something we celebrate, and it needs to be something that we know more about. Because I would say that at the moment, typically assessment, particularly in primary, is something, real assessment is something we think that arrives wrapped in plastic, written by somebody else. We give it out, we cross our fingers, and we just hope the children do well. And actually, assessment ought to be something that we are much more confident about engaging with as a profession.
Thank you, Alison. And as I can see Rob making notes furiously at the end there, if there are things that that you think of that you want to respond to from other panellists, please bring those up as we go through onto subsequent questions and such like, and hopefully we'll have some time at the end for a few questions from the whole group. So finally then on this question then, we switch to David Weston to answer the question, what makes great assessment?
I think it's quite exciting, actually, assessment, except when I was the data manager. That wasn't exciting, and no one was excited to see me. The spreadsheets guy and the Sims guy does not get a good reception when you come along and say, can I have your data, please? That's not great assessment. I think at first glance, when you look at assessment, you say, well, it's quite simple. Assessment and curriculum are two sides of the same coin. You know, it's absolutely clear. You need your map of exactly what children are learning, and assessment pinpoints you exactly on that map, and that's where they are, and then you can work out where they move forwards. Trouble is, learning isn't linear, is it? Because they might, when you ask that particular question, you get a snapshot of where that child was at that particular time on that particular day, and for all you know, a misconception might reassert itself later, or they might go backwards a bit, or something else might confuse them, or actually they guessed and you weren't completely sure. So assessment is sometimes fuzzier than we'd like it to be, and I absolutely agree with the comments saying that, you know, people say, right, do that question, that child can now do that, fine, that's progress, move on. And learning just isn't as linear as that. So I think that's one of the things we need to say. We need to sort of keep testing things in lots of different ways and check from different perspectives so children really understand things. But also, the act of asking a child to recall something is itself an act of teaching. So actually, assessment, we need to choose very, very carefully. If through assessment we repeatedly ask a child to recall a misconception, we strengthen that misconception. So that's a real issue, because asking a child to recall something actually strengthens those memories in their head. So actually we need to very carefully think about the assessment we're using, not just to feed the big beast data machine so that, you know, the spreadsheets person in school can be very excited. And I was very excited because I do like coloured spreadsheets. But we really carefully have to design the questions to support the teaching and say, well, how am I going to ask you the right questions now to prompt just enough recall and really strengthen the thing you're learning about? So I think great assessment needs to be incredibly carefully designed, needs to elicit information that can prompt helpful reflection by the pupil. It needs to elicit information to help the teacher give really useful feedback. It needs to relate in some way to that absolutely clear curriculum map, but it also needs to be strategically chosen to get pupils to recall and strengthen the right pieces of learning and the right pieces of understanding. So it needs to do all of these things. It's not just about measuring. Assessment is an act of teaching in itself.
Thank you very much for that. And if that notion that David was talking about there of assessment strengthening learning is something that's of real interest to you, if you have a look online at it's called the Bjork Learning and Forgetting Lab at UCLA, brilliant place. Lots and lots of great resources on there on the notion of retrieval practice, this idea of getting children to retrieve things that they have learned in the past, and the evidence on that suggests that it actually solidifies learning. Okay, so purpose seems to be one of the core elements that's drawn out of the answers from all of our panellists there. This notion that without a very, very clear focus, a clear purpose for an assessment, then designing it, ensuring that it meets the needs that we really want it to fulfill, actually become more and more limited. So I think for me, my kind of key takeaway there is that notion that without a very strong purpose, we are already somewhat limited in our success. Okay, so we've got a question. I can't remember it. So the question coming through on Twitter for Rob. Simply says, is the in your comment, an assessment that can't surprise you isn't an assessment? Is the you the assessor or the assessed? Please.
That's an interesting question. I'll have to think a bit more about that one. I think if it doesn't have the potential to surprise anyone, it's not an assessment. But yeah, assessment can be for the assessee and the assessor. They both look at information and it has different uses for them. So I think both.
Thank you. And we will come to questions from the group at the end. But we'll move on to our second question of the evening. So the question to all of our panellists is, what are the current and foreseeable assessment challenges and uncertainties facing educators? And we'll go with our alphabetical order. So Daisy, what are the challenges?
So I think there are real challenges at the minute around, there's been a lot of change over the last couple of years, both at primary and at secondary, and I think a lot of those changes haven't yet bedded in, and I think that in some cases at primary there will be further changes coming. So I think dealing with all those changes is tricky. I think that there's a real workload issue. So I'm really struck, the DFE do this regular workload survey, and from 2010 to 2013, they found that the amount of time primary teachers spend on assessment, which includes sort of marking and lots of related activities, had doubled from 5 hours a week to 10 hours a week. And that feels to me astonishing, that over the period of 3 years, the amount of time spent on assessment had doubled, 5 hours a week to 10 hours a week. And so if you look at issues around workload and the problems people are reporting with workload and the knock-on impact that has on recruitment and retention, I think, unfortunately, assessment might have a part to play in this. And I do think that the abolition of national curriculum levels was a really good thing. And I think that there are some schools out there who are using that vacuum to innovate and to come up with good ideas and good practices that I don't think could have been led in a top-down way. But I am also concerned that there are plenty of schools out there for whom it's meant a kind of a reinvention of the wheel. They've reinvented levels. I think there's a lot of practices out there which are very similar to levels. So I think the sort of slightly concerning thing is that we've had a huge reform process, but I'm not sure it's led to everybody ending up in a better place than they were before. So I think that's really problematic, and I think that's what's causing some of the workload issues. I also think, looking forward, I was on the Carter review of initial teacher training a couple of years ago, and we did this survey of initial teacher training and provision, and the sort of biggest weakness and the biggest gap that came up again and again and again was around assessment. So there were lots of really quite fundamental concepts to do with assessment that just weren't being taught in ITT. And I think that's going to be a huge challenge over the next few years too, that as schools take on more responsibility in a school-led system for improving assessment, they'll need more and more support and more professional development around assessment. And I think ITT needs to do more there as well.
Thank you very much. Just on that point of the increase in workload over the last few years, that 5 hours to 10 hours that Daisy was talking about, just as a show of hands in the room, particularly amongst primary colleagues, do you recognise that increase? Put your hands up if you recognise that increase that Daisy was talking about in terms of workload, particularly related to assessment. Okay, so So quite a few hands going up and some people using both hands. Thank you. Okay, so we'll move on. Rob, what are these challenges and uncertainties?
Challenges and uncertainties. I was asked to talk about this from a perspective of research, which I hope is not boring, but maybe won't feel like it's of direct day-to-day interest, like things like spending twice as long marking. But I think it's quite easy to come up with a list of questions that are essentially research questions that we probably don't have good answers to, but questions that I think people will often assume, and I'd include myself in this, that we kind of do know the answer to. And one of the things about research, I think if I'm here to argue the place of research, is that it does question what seems obvious and seems widely accepted and says, well, yeah, do we actually really know that? Is there good evidence? Does it stand up to robust scrutiny? So I've got a few questions which I would list, but as I say, I think the list could be quite a bit longer. One is, how can we make formative assessment work? A few people already talked about that. We know that there is good evidence behind formative assessment. We maybe don't quite know what formative assessment actually is, so that might be a problem. Again, it's a little bit of a basket of things, that all good things thrown together. Some analyses suggest that some of the claims in the original Black and William paper, for example, effect sizes between 0.4 and 0.7, that may have been a little optimistic, but there's still positive effects and it's still probably a good thing. But what we haven't been able to do, and there's massive enthusiasm for it around the world. Teachers say, yeah, formative assessment is great. We're all doing assessment for learning. It doesn't seem to have had any impact on learning outcomes, as far as anybody can see any sound research evidence for that. So I would argue it hasn't worked. It has this promise, it has this research pedigree, it has a lot of plausible reasons for thinking it ought to work, but we haven't got it to work. So why not? And what could we do better there? That would be one question. Well, that isn't one question, that's a whole research agenda, but it's one heading. If I'm allowed another one, I would say, what about assessment literacy? Again, a lot of interest in this. I'm interested in this, about the idea of helping teachers to understand assessment better, training teachers. We're doing projects, I'm working with Stuart and stuff, doing developing programs, for example. And a lot of reviews, Carter Review, but many others have said teachers, the gap between what teachers need to know about assessment and what is widely available in practice is too big, and we need to do something about it. Well, do we know that's the case? And if we do, what actually is it that teachers need to know that they don't know? How clear about that are we? One of the little ironies I quite like is that when assessment people start thinking about, well, what is this assessment literacy? Of course, one of the things they want to do is try and assess it. So they come up with ways of assessing assessment literacy, but sadly they don't seem to do it very well. So most of these measures are not actually very good. And that's an interesting challenge, because I think that it is the right thing to try and measure something. If you think you know what you're talking about, you should be able to operationalize it. In other words, you should be able to describe what kinds of behavior are examples of it and what kinds of behavior are not, and ways of capturing that behavior into something that you can then talk about, and we then all know we're talking about the same thing. And a lot of debate is at cross purposes and pointless because we fail to do that. So I don't think it's the wrong thing to say, oh, well, it's complex and you can't measure it. The right thing is to say, yeah, we need to measure it. Before you can measure something, though, you need to be clear what it is. And that's maybe part of the problem, that we haven't done the conceptual thinking there hard enough. And we certainly don't know. Again, there's some evidence that when you train teachers in certain ways, that there are benefits there perhaps for their students. Very limited, I would say. I don't think that amounts to a really solid body of evidence, but the evidence, as far as I know, is positive, so at least that's good. So those would be the big two, I think. And as I say, if I had 10 minutes... No. Right.
That's for the UK tour, when we get all of you in a bus and take you around the country doing this. Okay, so Sara Lee, from your point of view, what are the foreseeable assessment challenges and uncertainties?
Okay, thanks, Stuart. Well, we had to write our responses to these questions in advance. We were given a word limit. This was the one where I just sat down and wrote 1,000 words pretty quickly and could have gone on. So it's all been cut down, and rightly so. But so I'm going to focus on a couple of things, really. I think, first of all, that the challenges and uncertainties around our high-stakes accountability system, the external and internal pressures that are affecting the way we do assessment in schools. I'm going to talk about that, and I'm going to talk about, and I agree that we need to do a piece of work to develop deeper, more accurate understanding, better approaches to assessment in the life after levels era, and that's an opportunity. But there are a lot of things that get in the way, externally and internally, and some of them are also about some confusion about what it is. So yeah, we've got I'm talking from a secondary perspective more, but my primary colleagues talk about the same thing. A very unstable set of national performance measures, I feel, national qualifications in kind of perpetual big flux, lots of change. Those of us who've been working in schools, I've been a school leader for a couple of decades, I'll admit. I've seen a huge amount of change. Contextualised value-added levels of progress, AS levels, modular exams, grades levels, sub-levels, numerous types of qualifications. They've come, they've gone. We've trained people up, we've paid them allowances to get good at them, and then they've diplomas. I could go on, and I don't think it's going to stop. I think continual change is what we've got. I think politically there are reasons for that as well. So I don't foresee a period of stability where we can all just say, okay, let's just really think about this. I think we are in schools having to produce and work to the qualifications at the same time as trying to work out how to assess for them. And you know, when you're in a school and you're in a difficult place, I think it's even more difficult to make the space to do the work on assessment. So there's big challenges for teachers and leaders here. But it's our reality, this change. It's one that can open up opportunities as well as bringing threats, I think. And what I see a lot in school and in school I'm in and schools that we support, I'm seeing teachers feeling intense pressure. English teachers, maths teachers, I'm thinking about particularly, but others too. Real uncertainty about the measures by which they and their students are going to be judged this summer. And so I think in this climate, there's potential for threats, perverse incentives, all sorts of things to affect the way people do assessment, for tracking, for interim summative assessments, for assessment that produces knowledge, for leaders, for governors, for Ofsted if they're due, again, to get in the way of our thinking about how we assess to support learning. And I think within school we can do awful things to ourselves as well. And this is partly, I think, about accountability and measures. It's partly about the post-level vacuum, if you like. So some things have come along to fill that up, and some of them might be good. But I've seen a lot of complicated systems evolve quite quickly in schools, adding more and more to teachers' workload at the same time as teachers, and a lot of teachers in my school, learning to teach for linear specifications when they've only ever taught and themselves at school done modular GCSEs. So all this is impacting at the same time. So I'm making it sound like a perfect storm, and I think it feels like that. Governors encouraged to hold leaders to account, encouraged to ask for data more often, and especially where a school is needing to improve. And even the schools that undertake linear progress tracking with a really much lighter touch, I think haven't really devoted the time to get together a clear and informed approach to assessment, and to think about some of the things that are in Daisy's book, which certainly have interested a lot of staff in my school, and there's a feeling that we want to do some work on this, but at the moment we're too busy delivering, we're too busy churning it out. That's the sort of feeling. I think it is disappointing but not surprising to find that all the systems that have come along in life after levels, Daisy's talked about how they appear various, they're mostly reworkings of previous practice, so it feels like there's been a bit of a rush to put that in place. I do like the Star Wars YouTube. I don't know if you've seen it, where Luke Skywalker's got his red pen and his blue pen and his purple pen and he's this and he's that, and it does feel like that in schools. And I think also leaders, and I'm finishing, but I think as leaders we do it to ourselves. We're having it, we feel done to, so then we do something, we create a really unwieldy system, and then you also see teachers holding on to bits of the national strategy still, and still doing those things that the Dylan William idea that we've got to stop doing some things that we thought were good, but in a kind of confused landscape, I think sometimes. So this is the gloomy view, if you like. But I think within that there's some really exciting stuff about how we can think about memory and learning, and this is linear assessment has asked us to do that, and think about how we teach for that, and actually to think about teaching and about teaching a particular bit of what we want to learn, instead of constantly having to create this, if you like, shared meanings for lots of different people who've got a stake in how that teacher and that class are getting on that day. So I think it's a bit, for me, it's about clearing away and making a space to do some really interesting work. Sorry to have gone on.
No, not at all. It's interesting you talk about this kind of washback effect of assessments, coming back into schools and the impact that it has on what decisions are made. But then equally, you're talking about another kind of a sort of a reverse washback, where there's a space for innovation within schools, and maybe that kind of tide can be reversed in some way or other potentially. But anyway, moving on. Tim Oates, the foreseeable challenges and uncertainties.
Okay, thanks. So Rob mentioned that he was asked to talk from a particular perspective. And indeed, I was on these 3 questions, I was given the policy perspective, not that I'm a policymaker. So here we go, perspective from policy. It was, I found it slightly amusing, and this is not patronising of policymakers, but it was interesting during 2010-2015. If you remember the big discussion about increased autonomy in the system, very, very dominant discourse. But what was clear is that the policymakers are saying, yeah, you've got freedom to do all sorts of things, but not that. And I don't like that either. Now that was interesting, because it sort of communicated a sense that actually we have got an inkling of what we should be doing, and we do know direction. And that points to a particular policy challenge, I think, which is that even if you've determined a good policy, and like Daisy, I feel that the recommendation to remove levels was sound policy, one policy challenge is actually implementing that policy and getting it established and understood, so that practice and policy coincide. And certainly I've been around the country. I mean, we've desperately tried to fill the vacuum from Cambridge by pro bono support to hundreds of schools and thousands of teachers. But then the levels by any other name debate is again, ironically humorous. I'm sure the school knows which one it is, not in the room, but, we got rid of levels by introducing a new framework of 10 levels, was said to me. I agree with Rob. There are things which don't look as though they're levels because they don't mention the word levels, but they are levels, and they have the same underlying model of ability and discrimination and labelling associated with them. And that points to another vacuum which Alison talked about, which is the issue of knowledge and expertise of the boring technical stuff around assessment throughout our system, societally, amongst teachers, leaders, students, teachers. And actually, if we could establish that technical understanding, we might get more stability. And I agree with Rob, some of the things we want to measure are complex, but we can measure them if we approach it in the right way. So just to sum up, from the policy perspective in terms of nations, this whole idea of just what we need is to get rid of high-stakes assessment, and we need just loads of low-stakes assessment. Forget it. Low-stakes assessment become high-stakes assessment almost instantly. You just see it all the way around the world. And modern states have got a legitimate interest in knowing where the money's going in terms of equity and attainment, both things which I think are very desirable. And many nations, not just England, have begun to up the stakes around assessment, to use them as part of public accountability, and to try to use them to steer education, to steer it through assessment information. The problem is, under those kind of pressures, assessment can begin to dominate the curriculum, and incentives to cheat can become overwhelming, whether this is on the part of candidates or on the part of teachers being held to account. And there comes a point where good assessment design and careful requirements around the administration of the assessments can only do so much to support the dependability of the assessment. Incentives and drivers around the assessment begin to distort both the assessment and the curriculum. So in the text, I've talked about the Goldilocks principle at the centre of good assessment. Assessments should be challenging to stimulate and support worthwhile learning, but not so challenging that they are unattainable through reasonable effort. And assessments should be valuable to the states that so frequently fund their development administration, but balanced by their value to teachers and students. They should support equity and attainment in education, but still discriminate accurately between those who have attained something and those who have not. That sweet spot in optimising the different tensions is by no means easy to maintain and needs constantly to be solved.
Thanks, Tim. And Tim referred there to the text, and several of our panellists have talked about their written answers, and all of those will be available from www.assessment.academy/ebook for you to download freely immediately after this event. So, Alison, Peacock, from your point of view, what are the current and foreseeable challenges and uncertainties facing educators?
Well, it's not good enough, is it, really? I mean, we're all sitting here at the end of a long day, worrying about assessment, feeling that assessment's out of control. We're all working with children and young people who are also worrying about assessment. And we've got experts sitting up here I'm not including myself in that, but we've got experts here sort of saying, well, and we don't really know what the answers are. It seems to me it's very important that as a profession we seize hold of this, that we really do start to work together to understand from each other where we can use assessment in a way that is meaningful and helpful, where we can enable students to really achieve ambitions, where teachers feel confident to plan a curriculum that is open-ended enough and presents enough challenge in it so that we can give the children the best possible chances to learn, and where our subject knowledge is such that when we're called upon to assess the progress that's been achieved, we are confident in being able to say about progress because we understand how our subject develops. I think too often we don't have access to the quality of learning that we need as a profession. And of course, she would say that, wouldn't she? But that's why we've established the Chartered College of Teaching. But it's also why other colleagues are here on this panel today, because I think in pursuit of expertise about assessment, then we start to address all of the issues that we're worried about. And we're more likely, as a profession, to be heard. We're more likely to be in a place where, in fact, the assessment is fit for purpose. There are so many challenges, and I agree with my colleague, my head teacher colleague earlier on. You know, one could go on for a very long time about this. But to be optimistic about it is to say, this is the start of something. This is the start of us. In the same way that the Learning First Beyond Levels conference is a start of something which is about gathering people together to say, what can we do about this? What can we learn from each other? What can we learn about what makes good assessment? How can we make the best possible opportunities available for our children and young people? And at the moment, unfortunately, it's often in spite of the system. It would be great if we can help to inform the system.
Thank you. And finally, for this question, David Weston.
So I think a really big challenge we have now and we will continue to have is the tension between understanding, well, what are pupils actually learning now and how can I learn about their learning, and quality assurance. Quality assurance of the system, quality assurance of the teachers, quality assurance of the schools. Because, well, as a number of people alluded to, there is an incorrect assumption that an assessment designed as a valid test of pupil learning can also act as an equally valid test of teacher effectiveness without compromising either. That's a real issue, because it's likely that it's going to be really good at one or really good at the other, but it's going to be spectacularly difficult to make it really good at both. And of course, it changes the incentives completely, because if I'm trying to do a really good test of pupil learning, and I'm also using that test as an act of teaching, that's a very different set of decisions than I am trying to extract information that will prove that what I am doing, my institution is doing, and the people helping my institution are doing is good. And the pressure, of course, is very much on the latter. Everyone is desperate to try and show that they are helping children make progress, therefore their teaching is good, therefore their school is good, therefore the school leadership is good, therefore the local authority and the MAT and everything is good as well. And there is that really inherent tension, I think, that's at the heart of it. We have to overcome that challenge. Perhaps we need to separate things out a little bit. Perhaps we have to look at tests for different purposes. We then immediately start having an issue with the amount of time it all takes, of course. So the key question for me, I think we have to overcome is, when are we doing quality assurance, and when are we using assessment as an act of teaching to really understand, to elicit feedback, to help that child learn, and when are we trying to conflate the two and are in danger of severe difficulties?
Thank you. And that actually wraps that up really neatly by bringing us very firmly back to the notion of purpose in assessment. So, 2 down and 1 to go, and hopefully we've kind of come through the dark times of talking about assessment. It's now time to ask for some optimism, some concrete actions that the profession itself can take to address some of these challenges that have been specified by our panel. So that question, what action can the profession take to address these challenges, is the one that I'd like to put to you all now. And we will go back to the start again and put that question first to Daisy.
Thanks very much. So I think there's some really exciting ways in which the profession can use technology to improve assessment. So one thing I'm really interested in, people have talked about it for a long time, and Tim alluded to it earlier as well, but I think crowdsourced items and formative item banks are a really interesting idea. There's quite a few organisations out there providing sort of, online repositories for these kind of things. And so the idea is you come up with a great question or a great multiple choice question, and you put it into a bank, and if you get lots of different pupils from across the country taking that question, you then start to build up some data on how they find it and how they use it, and the best ones you can refine over time, and you can use them in all kinds of different contexts. So it's something we've experimented with a little bit at ARC. It's certainly something you can do in an individual school. We've done it across some of the secondary schools in our network, and it is really interesting, and it also can lead to some really good CPD, having discussions around why pupils find certain questions challenging, or why pupils in a certain class or a certain school found a particular question less challenging, what was happening there with the teaching. So I think that kind of formative item bank, crowdsource items are really interesting, and they get to the heart of, as Tim was talking about, of trying to work out how you assess the construct. And when you create them together, actually, you have all kinds of interesting discussions. So when we build some on grammar, we create some multiple choice questions on grammar, or on some of the novels that our pupils are studying. We have really fascinating discussions around, well, what is the common misconception here that you should use as a distractor, and those kinds of things. I think that's one really positive way. The other way we're also interested in at ARC, which we've used a bit, and which I'm going to be more involved with in the summer, is comparative judgment. So I think comparative judgment works very well for open-ended tasks, which traditionally are very difficult to mark reliably. So comparative judgment, instead of asking you to mark an essay against a rubric, instead you see two essays, you have to say which is the better piece of writing, or which is the more creative story. And you make that judgment, you make a series of decisions like that, and the algorithm in the comparative judgment engine works out the measurement scale based on all of those decisions. And I think we've had quite a bit of success with that, because first of all, it's much quicker, so it's solving workload problems. Second of all, it's much more reliable, so we've got some astonishing levels of reliability for writing tasks that normally can be quite fractious to mark and moderate. And also, I think the other powerful thing about it is the positive washback it has on teaching. So the fact that you don't have to rely on things like the interim frameworks, which I know lots of primary teachers are really struggling with, that very tick box approach to writing that's encouraged by them. Comparative judgment allows you to make very holistic judgments. So it allows you to just look at two pieces of writing and say which is the better piece of writing, not which is the one that's got a fronted adverbial, 2 hyphens, and 3.5 sort of uses of the passive voice. So I think our teachers have really liked it because of that. So both those approaches, I think, really to be realised, depend on technology. And I think some of those maybe, again, slightly can be seen as quite boring uses of technology. As Tim said, it's not the sort of virtual reality headsets that you see at BET, but I think it's still a really powerful use of technology. And I think when you dig down into what it's achieving and the way that it's allowing you to assess holistic tasks in a reliable manner, I think there is something extraordinarily exciting at the heart of that.
Thank you. There's a quick show of hands again. Has anybody in the room had a go with a comparative judgment engine, which may have been called No More Marking? Other comparative judgment engines are available. So a few people have had a go. Okay, I've had a go with some of my PhD students, and it's certainly something that caused really fascinating discussion about the quality of pieces of writing, and and also the quality of the judgments that they themselves were making, and how they went about it. So, one to think about. Rob Coe.
Okay, so from the research perspective again, I think there's a number of things. And actually one is about the joining up of researchers and practitioners and researcher practitioners, and the need to take questions like the ones that I mentioned before, to think that those are important and to have an agenda, research agenda around them, and to do the kind of research that actually has some value for practitioners. It answers the questions that people working in classrooms want to know the answers to. So that, I think, is a really important opportunity, and I think the profession of teachers and profession of researchers need to get their act together and sort that out. And there are some real signs of optimism there, I think, and in no small part due to the achievements and actions of people who are in this room today with us. So things like Research Ed, I would mention the Education Endowment Foundation, and of course I would mention the Chartered College of Teaching as a real strong force, I think, there in bringing those groups together and promoting that agenda. Related to that is the need to have opportunities and mechanisms for what might be thought of as plausibly effective professional learning. And I think that's a real obstacle at the moment still. And maybe this is a bit of a sore point for me, because last week I was trying to sell somebody a training program in assessment, and they were saying that we won't get teachers out for more than half a day, maybe a day if you really stretch it. And all the evidence is really clear that that's a pointless thing to do. You need more time to learn complex stuff. So we're conflicted there, but somehow we have to do something to change that. And I also think, I was thinking about this, going back to the Macintosh Commission, which again, a few of us here were part of for our sins. There were, can you remember how many recommendations that commission made? No, okay, well, I think there were 8 actually. None of which, as far as I can see, have actually been implemented. So included among those were, and I tried to write this on the train on the way down, so my handwriting's a bit wobbly, but assessment should be included in the core content for teacher training. Have we really changed that? There should be a government requirement for a suitable training course for one person within each teaching school alliance who will become a specialist leader in education on assessment. Do we have any specialist leaders in education from teaching school alliances in the room today? Please show your hands. Okay, we have 1. That's very good. Right, 2. Okay, so this has not been a kind of groundswell mass movement then, but at least 2 people have benefited from that, possibly, or have perhaps done it despite the recommendations. And then there was also a recommendation for a training module, a development of a training module that could be used for both senior leaders in schools and Ofsted inspectors. Do we have any senior leaders or Ofsted inspectors who have benefited from a government-developed training module? No. Okay. So it's not clear then that there's been a big policy shift. I know no policy makers will be here in the room today or watching this on YouTube because they're all out campaigning and stuff like that. But I think this was 2 years ago those recommendations were published. So it is a little sad that nothing seems to have happened for something that is supposedly, we all think, a high priority area anyway. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Sarah.
Okay, so I'm going to be more cheerful now. Yep. 2 areas really. One is, how do we move forward? How do we respond as a profession? Well, we've got to have some way of dealing with the pressures that I've described in the previous answer. So we've got to do that, and we've also got to really take on board thinking about assessment. So, I'm not going to repeat what my more technically expert colleagues have said, but there's a lot of interesting stuff there, and there's a lot we can do if we make some space to engage with it. As I said, I've got a group of staff who they're going to form a working group really based on the recommendations in Daisy's book, and I think that's a really great starting point. And I think that's not something I, as the head, have made happen. The book's been doing the rounds at school, and there's a group of staff who want to spend some time thinking and talking about it. So I say, great. And that is such a positive sign. But we do need to address the challenges that we've described that confuse the purpose of assessment, that put pressures on it. And for that, I think you need brave and collaborative leadership. And I don't say it lightly, because I think, it's easy to be brave when things are going really well, but there are a lot of school leaders under great pressure, and then I think it's quite difficult to be brave and make that professional learning time that Rob has described for teachers really to do the proper work. Because I don't think this is let's get some top tips for the classroom then, and here we go. Clearly it's not. But I think, as I said before, I don't want to generalise too sweepingly, but I think there's a real sense of urgency in secondary schools about finding out how to teach and assess for linear GCSEs. The new content approaches there are also getting us to rethink curriculum right across the 11 to 18 spectrum. And at the same time, we've got these varying degrees of confidence about the post-life after levels systems that we're starting to operate and try to make sense of. And I think all that gives us the conditions where teachers are asking some big questions. So as leaders, I think it's our challenge then within schools to try to make the space to work on those. I think collaboration is really important as well, because what we've got too in the kind of areas of interesting marking and feedback systems is lots of schools inventing lots of different things. I think as schools we know about getting together on assessment in order to moderate, in order to standardise and all that sort of thing, and there's a lot of talk about doing that and a lot of time being put into that, but that's not the same as getting together as schools on really how to do great assessment that supports learning. I think that's something different, and I think it is something we need to do. In our school, we were lucky, we were successful to obtain some workload challenge funding to look at relationship between marking and learning in the wider context of assessment. And again, that was something that came from someone within my school who really wanted to do that. And now we've got 3 different schools' English departments working together. And if anyone's a secondary English teacher, you'll know about assessment and marking. And they're working on an inquiry into effective forms of feedback in the context of assessment, but also in the context of teacher workload, and using some of the kinds of technology and thinking that Daisy's been talking about. So I think that's really positive. There's a lot of potential to drive and disseminate assessment reform at grassroots level, at teacher level, I think. And things like research ed movement show that. If you're at a research ed conference, you'll find a lot of teachers who've gone there on a Saturday, and some of them have paid for it themselves if their schools haven't, to engage in this sort of work together. So I think there's a movement there. We say have a self-improving school system. I pose that as a question, really. If we do have that, then that's really where we need to work on this. The current level of national debate about assessment and then the concerns that we've got could help us to develop this in a widespread way. But I also think you're into talking about school improvement on a national scale here, and I think that's a hugely problematic area. It's a very patchy, complicated picture, lots of players, teaching schools, maths, local authorities, commercial companies, regional schools commissioners who've got grants to give for school improvement, and we don't really know what that's going to look like either. So I think we're about to enter into a new phase of targeted school improvement funding, and we don't really know about the reality of that or about how these players could work together. So I think, to me, it comes back to mobilising the profession at much more a grassroots level, as I've said. But of course, we need the knowledge, we need the evidence, and we need the interpretations of it that make it accessible for us. So like some of the meta studies, some of the kinds of things coming out of EEF to help us. I really welcome this debate, the involvement of the Chartered College of Teaching. I think it's much better if we do this work together through really good professional learning for teachers. I'm going to finish, but what I'm not asking for is a system to do this handed down to us from government. I think we know there's huge problems with that, and I think therefore, although it's hard work and although it's bitty, I think we have to work on this as a profession.
Thank you. Tim Oates.
Thank you. Okay, so again, from policy perspective, and likewise, the formation of the college, I think, is very, very important in respect of this mutuality of interest and trust, and that's going to be the theme of just the 2 minutes I spend on this. So, absolutely, the constructs, the things we want to assess, those will remain contested, and there are very different views in systems and across systems about what the focus of assessment should be in terms of knowledge, skills, and understanding. That will remain contested, and quite rightly so. Purpose and use, the purpose of assessment and the use of the outcomes, we should be very clear about the criteria we bring to purpose and what we say is permissible and irresponsible use of the outcomes. But don't forget that assessment is usually based on a question or a series of questions put to someone in order to elicit a response from them. And it's been fascinating looking back at the history of assessment around the world and contemporary practice. And in one Asian setting, we were exploring the use of one particular question, and it turned out that this question has been asked for 500 years. Okay, and it's a really good and sensible question, and it always works in stimulating understanding and revealing misconceptions. And we've been doing the same in Cambridge. I mean, Robin Miller has been doing excellent work in York, really trying to identify these really powerful questions. And they're often suitable for more than one purpose, summative and formative. Interesting. I mean, I'm not naive enough to think that assessment should only ever carry one purpose. It usually won't. Okay, but it certainly shouldn't carry conflicting purposes which contaminate the assessment and learning process. So we've been doing work in Cambridge on this, and we've been looking at the Isaac physics questions, brilliant questions from 1933, which are now being picked up and used in schools all over England. There's something to this. So this next bit sounds a bit like a justification for an assessment agency or assessment specialist. It's not. It's about mutuality of interest, and it recognises that there's asymmetry of knowledge of assessment at the moment. And so what I say is this, that while work on crowdsourced assessment shows that the work that Rob and I and others are doing show that good questions abound in education, there's still a need for highly technical quality assurance to select and refine those questions to enable tests and examinations to meet quality thresholds. Assessment agencies and specialist groups are not some institutional anachronism, but they offer a vital service, a service which should be delivered in conjunction with teachers and educational institutions. Building trust and mutuality of interest in dependable assessment is essential. We don't have it at the moment, it's essential. And this is one means of ensuring that assessment is not seen as something wholly external to education, to be gamed wherever possible. What we need is that mutuality and trust to know that good education is seen as the best route to assessment, and that this then places assessment in its rightful place as a servant, not the master of curriculum, of curriculum aims. Yeah, technology, so exciting. I mean, that will help with robust, unobtrusive, and relatively inexpensive security around assessment, just as it will help with easier registration and test taking. But in all of this, there lurks this question of cost. High quality assessment, and that's what we want, acts as a vital bridge between so many parts of the education system, reassuring parents of children's progress, reassuring the state that schools and colleges are pursuing desired goals, linking education and the labour market by providing assurance of skills and knowledge. It's not cheap. Good assessment, however, should be relatively inexpensive in respect to those purposes. For example, in England, the cost of all GCSEs and A-levels comes in at just under 2% of the total budget for secondary schools. So it's not cheap, but it should always be worthwhile, and thus justify its cost. Efficiency should always be chased, but not at the expense of compromising trust and quality. And what I'm asserting here is something quite controversial, that accurate assessment is a common good. And we should all see that common good in assessment.
Thank you. Alison.
So here we have another common good. This is the journal from the Chartered College of Teaching. Get excited. It should be coming through your letterboxes any moment, if it hasn't arrived already. Next term, the theme will be on assessment. And we're delighted that Professor Dylan William will be our guest editor of the journal. This is the beginning of a collaboration, colleagues. This is about how we learn from each other, how we engage with expertise, how we seize hold of assessment in order that we can do the best we can for our children.
Thank you. And finally, David Weston.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I'm just going to note that, if we spend 2% of what we spend on education and assessment, we only spend about half of it on improving teachers, on professional development. So that feels like a bit of an issue to me, and as much as if teachers are our key resource, then perhaps some of those percentages are wrong. You'd expect me to say that, wouldn't you? I also think another thing you'd probably expect me to say is we need to think about professional development as well, because really effective professional development is not one person telling another one generic processes of how to teach. Pretty much we know that's going to be completely useless waste of everybody's time, broadly, give or take a bit. What we need to do is get teachers learning both assessment and curriculum. They need to be thinking of the techniques that are rooted within particular topics, not only the techniques to teach, but how to assess. They need to constantly, as they are learning, we know really effective teacher learning is in itself an act of constantly assessing, have I made a difference yet? And that requires learning about assessment, and that requires getting better at assessment. Formative assessment is right at the heart of effective professional development. So if we're going to get schools better at assessment, we need to get schools better at professional development. And I've alluded to this a number of times before, we must improve and change our appraisal and performance management systems. We will not improve assessment in schools until we change these systems. These systems are holding back effective assessment in schools because they are being used for the wrong purposes. They're being asked to deliver numbers and data which they're simply not capable of doing. They're stopping teachers from focusing on using assessment as an act of teaching, and they're using it as assessment as an act of getting the rod off their own back. We must change that. We must put teacher learning at the heart of our schools, and that's why I'm really excited. This event is happening, great professionalism is happening, and the Chartered College of Teaching is happening. So I'm very delighted and also rather honoured to be at the end of such an illustrious panel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let's put our hands together for the answers from all of our panellists. So something odd is happening tonight, because you're all here in a room listening to people talk about assessment, and also on Twitter this hashtag #AssessBetter is now trending. There's something going on with an interest in assessment, and I think that your attendance here tonight is testament to that. The words of our panellists also indicate that there really is something tangible here, and actually a lot of people have talked about what we know and what we don't know. I would argue that in our country, in our schools, in our government, in our universities, in our member organisations and charities, we know everything that we could probably need to know about really great assessment. It's probably already there. We just need to be able to collaborate, to innovate together in order to drive forwards assessment that is really, truly purposeful for those things that we want it to be purposeful for and that we need it to be purposeful for. Now, I'm very mindful of time, and I'm also mindful of the school's time and the fact that people here need to close down and such like. I want this conversation to continue, and I want you to be able to ask questions, but I want you to ask those questions directly to our panel members over some food and drinks after this, so we'll let them get down from the platform. But through in the staff room at the back there, but also in here, please continue this discussion, but also continue the discussion in your staff rooms, continue it online, continue it wherever, because without that continued discussion about assessment more broadly, what makes great assessment, achieving it, again, will be very, very limited. So I'd like you once again to please put your hands together, both for the school that has hosted and for your panel.